year ago this afternoon, I was sitting in my office in the Russell office building when news reports began to flash about a shooting at a school in South Florida and at a high school. And as the father at the time, and in the case of one of my two oldest children still, a high school student in South Florida, you'd normally be interested just as a senator from the state, but you'd most particularly be interested as a parent. As it turns out, the incident and the shooting took place at a school 50 miles, about 50 minutes from my home. And we all know the story and the lives that were lost in this terrible tragedy. I want to say at a personal level, it clearly is an issue that has affected me, first because I'm one of the two senators that represents the state. Every person impacted, every victim, everyone that was wounded, are constituents of ours. But also, as I've pointed out, my two oldest children are of the same age as the victims. And when you see the pictures and you hear the stories, you can't help but recognize the stories and the pictures. Maybe not individually. I didn't know any of the victims personally, but the stories are familiar. They're the stories of my children and their friends who are of the same age and at the same time in their life. And it is impossible to fully comprehend unless you've gone through it. By the grace of God, I have not. But unless you've gone through the loss of a child, particularly under such tragic and traumatic circumstances. That said, throughout the last 12 months, as we reached different milestones in my two daughters' lives, whether it was the prom, or graduation day, or dropping off my oldest in college, or a class ring ceremony for a junior, we were almost reminded for just a moment of the parents who had expected to be doing the same during this time of year, but were unable. I have learned a lot from those parents, many of whom I've gotten to know personally and worked in the last year alongside on a number of issues. And in the year that has passed, they have turned their grief into effective activism, as have the students. But the parents in particular are the ones that I have interacted with the most here in Washington on a regular basis. And it is why I thought appropriate to come to the floor today, because I think they would say that the best way to honor the memory of the children that they lost is to take actions that work to make sure that no other parents will ever have to face this again. Several of the parents have publicly described what happened a year ago today as the most avoidable mass murder in American history. But what was it that enabled this to happen? Why was it avoidable? What could have been done to address it? And in the brief moments that we have here, my colleague from Florida will have additional statements as well. I wanted to point to some of the things we now know that we didn't know a year ago today or in the days that followed. But from it, not only should it spark outrage, but it should also spark ideas about how to fix those things. So never again will any parent have to face what they did, and none of my colleagues stand here and give a speech like the one that the senator from Florida and my colleague from Florida and I have to give today. At the outset, let me say that the credit for much of what I'm about to speak about belongs to the extraordinary journalists at the South Florida Sun-Sentinel, who have done a remarkable job over the last 10 months of revealing to the public many facts that would have been unknown otherwise. In a time when there's so much debate about journalism and its role in our society and public service and politics, they deserve tremendous credit for bringing this to light. And I think it is an example of why journalism remains an important institution in our country. A lot of the attention in this debate has been paid to the issues that we're familiar with and have been debated long before this tragedy: a ban on certain weapons, universal background checks, taking on what's described as the gun lobby. And these issues dominated the national media coverage, and these support for these positions is not new. They predate this tragedy. And in our republic, people most certainly have the right to advocate for this or against it. They have the right to lobby for it. They have the right to vote for candidates who support these positions and to vote against those who do not. They're valid issues to debate on public policy. But at the end of the day, neither go directly to the heart of this particular case and of the facts that led up to it. At the heart of this is that the killer, the perpetrator of this terrible tragedy, was known to be dangerous for a long time by many people in positions of power and authority at the school district, and the sheriff's office, at the FBI, and no one did anything about it. This is now a documented fact. Early in the days after this, we saw images of the sheriff and the superintendent lecturing people and talking about what a great job they had done. But it is, in fact, the facts will show that it was their incompetence that allowed this to happen. And then even worse, they tried to cover it up. In an article entitled "School's Culture of Tolerance Let Students Like the Killer Slide" by Megan O'Matz and Scott Travis, reporters at the South Florida Sun-Sentinel, I'm just going to read from it, and then I'm going to introduce it to the record. I'm not going to read the whole article. But here's how it opens. Broward schools have grown so tolerant of misbehavior that students, like the killer, are able to slide by for years without strict punishment for conduct that could be criminal. The culture of leniency allows children to engage in an endless loop of violations and second chances, creating a system where kids who commit the same offense for the 10th time may be treated like if it was the first. The killer was suspended at least 67 days over less than a year and a half at West Glades Middle School, and his problems continued at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. The South Florida Sun-Sentinel obtained the killer's discipline records. They reviewed discipline policies, and here's what they found. Students can be considered first-time offenders even if they commit the same offense year after year. The district's claim of reforming bad behavior is exaggerated. Lenient discipline has an added PR benefit for the district: lower suspensions, expulsions, and arrests, along with rising graduation rates. It goes on to say, many teachers and parents say Broward has created a culture in which teachers are expressly told or subtly pressured not to send students to the administration for punishment, so a school's image is not tarnished. One teacher taught for 37 years in the district before retiring. She said she retired early due to her concerns about student discipline. Here's a quote. "It was so many things. I had 3 students bring knives to my classroom. One was out of the classroom for 1 day. Another had so many things on his record he was gone for 5 days. None were expelled." Part of this leniency is a program called the Promise Program, which the superintendent of the district claims has a 90% success rate at keeping students from reoffending. That's a misleading statistic, because a student can commit a subsequent infraction without being considered a repeat offender as long as it's not the exact same violation in the exact same year. Each year, they start with a clean slate. And in the interest of time, the rest of the article, I ask unanimous consent that the rest of this article be entered into the record.
Without objection.
Second article, I'll be brief on this one. Sun-Sentinel, Scott Travis. Broward schools fought against 2013 plan for more security money. They turned down a proposal to levy $55 million in tax dollars for school safety. And one of the quotes is, one of the school board members slammed the proposal. They said they'd rather ask voters for money to improve technology and renovate old schools, which they did in November 2014. In hindsight, a terrible mistake. Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that this article be submitted into the record.
Without objection.
And another article from the Sun-Sentinel, what's being done to stop another school shooting? Again, very long article. I'll just say this. Once he decided to shoot up a school, there wasn't much to stop the killer. His threats were ignored. Campus was wide open. School doors were unlocked. Students had nowhere to hide. And what has changed after 10 months since the shooting? This was back from December 29, 2018. At least a quarter of campuses do not have a single entry point to control intruders. Safe spaces to protect children in classrooms haven't been identified. The killer wasn't welcome at that high school, by the way. He was known by former classmates and even some administrators as a potential school shooter, yet he still walked right on campus. It goes on to say that the killer didn't keep his homicidal urges quiet. The school incompetently handled the threat he represented to his fellow classmates and teachers. The killer's lust for violence had been documented officially 69 times in his life. At least 30 people knew of his troubling behavior before the shooting. In fact, I have here with me the record of those 69 discipline points. It's extensive, and I ask unanimous consent that that record be entered into the record.
Without objection.
Wrapping up on this point, another article from the Sun Sentinel that I ask unanimous consent that we submit to the record, entitled "Hide, Deny, Spin, Threaten: How the School District Tried to Mask Failures That Led to the Shooting." And it talks about efforts that were made by the school district to keep from the public the sort of things that we're now finding out. So I ask unanimous consent that that article be submitted.
Without objection.
And finally, what the school district knew about the Parkland shooter is another article that talks about time and again how this killer told people he was going to do this. Not just one person, multiple people. And nothing was in place to do anything about it. I ask unanimous consent that the article entitled "Sun Sentinel: Here's What Broward Schools Knew About Parkland Shooter, Details Revealed by Mistake" be entered into the record.
Without objection.
I wrap up with a couple of points. The first is that the Stoneman Douglas Commission, impaneled by the state, looked at these shootings, and from it I think are pretty instructive of some of the things I hope we can work on together. It looked at a 20-year period, and it found 48 individuals committed 46 of these attacks. 35 were students, 10 were former students. So 45 of the 48 were either students or former students. It found that the most typical weapon used was a semi-automatic pistol. It found that 50% of these attacks were done with weapons that were taken from the home, not even purchased, taken from the home. And it found that in 4 of 5 incidents, at least one person had some knowledge that they were going to do this, and in more than half the cases, at least 2 people knew they were going to do this. It is on the basis of these discoveries, working with many of the parents whose children lost their lives a year ago today, that last year we pursued on a bipartisan basis and passed the Stop School Violence Act, which provides over a 10-year period $100 million a year for strengthening school security, providing school training to identify threats before they take action, creating school threat assessments and crisis intervention. That has passed. It is why this year I have reintroduced the Extreme Risk Protection Order and Violence Protection Act, which will dedicate the Department of Justice funds to incentivize states to give law enforcement the authority to prevent individuals who pose a threat to themselves or others the ability to purchase or possess firearms, so that if information like what was available to authorities in Parkland are available to people now, they can actually go to court. They can go to court, prove their case with due process, and take the guns away from this person before they go out and commit this crime, and more importantly, alert their parents to secure the guns at home so they don't use that gun to commit the crime. I've also introduced a bipartisan bill, Threat Assessment Prevention and Safety Act, creates a task force of experts to provide recommendations for a national strategy to keep our communities safe from targeted violence through threat assessment and management, which experts say is the best way to identify potential killers before they act. If something like this had been in place, it is highly likely that authorities, putting all this together, what we know today, would have said, this individual is a serious threat, and we need to do something about it before they take action. And finally, yesterday, Senator Grassley and I reintroduced the EAGLES Act, which would reauthorize and expand the U.S. Secret Service National Threat Assessment Center to help communities proactively mitigate threats of violence in schools. It is my hope that this terrible tragedy and what we have learned about it will guide us, will provide us a roadmap of concrete steps that we can take to empower communities, schools, and police departments, and parents and families with the tools they need, not just to identify people who are potentially violent, but to prevent it from happening, get out ahead of it. Maybe it's a risk assessment, maybe it's institutionalized mental health or wraparound services, but anything that can be done. And I raise all this today because if you were to speak to the families, as I know my colleague from Florida and I often do, they will tell you that the most important thing we can do to honor the memory of their children that they lost in this terrible tragedy is to make sure it doesn't happen to anybody else. And now, one more thing we'd like to do to honor the victims of this tragedy. My colleague, Senator Scott, and I have put forth a resolution that commemorates this day. It honors the survivors. It pledges continued support for their recovery. It recognizes the strength and resiliency of Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School and the community that surrounds it. It expresses gratitude to the emergency medical and healthcare professionals of the community for their efforts in responding and caring for the victims and survivors. Most of all, it commemorates the victims that were killed in the attack, and it offers the Senate's heartfelt condolences and deepest sympathies to the families, loved ones, and friends of the victim. Madam President, as of in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the consideration of Senate Res. 71 submitted earlier today.
Clerk will report.
Senate Resolution 71, honoring the memory of the victims of the senseless attack at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School 1 year ago.
Is there objection to proceeding of the measure? Without objection, the Senate will proceed to the measure.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and that the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Madam President, I yield the floor.